The millionaire CEO had no idea he had twins until their mother approached him during the grand opening of his luxurious beach resort. From that moment, everything began to change. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Lincoln Hollister stood at the edge of the makeshift stage on the beach, gazing out over a sea of guests gathered for the evening's grand opening. The warm light of sunset washed across the sand, painting everything in gold. His heart was pounding, but not from nerves about the speech he was about to give. He was used to addressing investors and high society figures. This was different. Tonight, he felt an odd restlessness, as though his instincts were warning him that something big was about to happen. Up ahead, rows of bright lanterns swayed gently, illuminating the gleaming arches of his newly completed resort. The building had been a labor of love, the culmination of months of planning and more money than he cared to admit. Now, reporters, partners, staff, and well-wishers circled around the platform, waiting for him to speak. When he glanced to the back of the improvised seating area, he caught sight of something, or someone, who made his breath hitch. Standing near the last row was a woman he recognized instantly. The curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin, her posture, everything about her was unmistakable. Naomi Stone. She looked poised and tense, wearing a simple yet elegant dress, hair pinned back in a way that threw all the focus on her striking face. A flood of memories and questions rushed through Lincoln's mind. Months ago, she had worked closely with him as a consultant, bright and ambitious, until the day she vanished without explanation. She had left behind a swirl of rumors and the faint scent of heartbreak. His personal assistant, Olivia, sidled up to him, a clipboard clutched in one hand. "Mr. Hollister, you're on in 10 seconds, she hissed, her eyes darting between him and the rest of the event staff. He swallowed and forced himself to face forward, stepping toward the microphone with a confident stride. The applause that greeted him was thunderous at first. Cameras flashed in the gathering twilight, capturing every moment for the news outlets that would undoubtedly broadcast his every word. Lincoln was usually composed in the spotlight, but the sight of Naomi standing at the back had rattled him. His planned speech almost slipped from his mind. Clearing his throat, he began, "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for what I hope will be the start of a new era in luxury hospitality. Tonight we open the doors of Hollister Beach Resort." He paused when his gaze drifted again, almost involuntarily, toward that same spot. Naomi was still there, her eyes fixed on him. He stumbled over his next line and heard an uncertain murmur pass through the crowd. For a split second, he considered ignoring her presence, focusing solely on the speech. But ignoring Naomi had never been easy, certainly not now. Determined to maintain control, he continued, "A place where families and friends can gather, forging memories that last a lifetime." The words felt hollow. He wondered if she had come to hear him talk about families of all things. Did she know how often he'd thought about her after she left? The applause rose again as he ended his remarks. He offered a short nod of thanks and moved away from the microphone, making a beeline toward the back rows. Olivia called his name, but he slipped past her as gracefully as possible. A few journalists trailed after him, possibly sensing something unusual in his demeanor. Naomi seemed to notice him approach and turned sharply, trying to dodge the lights and slip behind a cluster of VIP guests. Lincoln quickened his pace, weaving through pockets of onlookers, some of whom tried to engage him in polite conversation. Finally, near a service corridor that led away from the main event, he caught up with her. "Naomi," he said, breathless. She stopped, reluctance evident in every tense line of her body. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his, and he saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. "Lincoln," she managed, voice subdued against the muffled music playing on the beach. "I didn't want to. Look, I'm sorry for showing up like this. I just had to come." He gestured for her to follow him out of the direct path of the crowd. The corridor was quiet and cool, a sharp contrast to the celebratory buzz outside. A single string of fairy lights faintly illuminated the space, revealing the anxious expression on Naomi's face. "I thought you disappeared for good," he said, his tone more blunt than he intended. "No calls, no messages. You were gone." He tried to rein in the frustration. "Why are you here?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find the right words. "It's complicated," she whispered. "I couldn't stay away any longer." Before he could press her further, a flash pierced the corridor. A knot of reporters, cameras raised, swarmed around the bend. They'd sniffed out a scene and now converged with frenzied excitement. Panicking, Naomi shrank back. "Mr. Hollister, who's the woman?" a reporter shouted. Another tried to blind them with a barrage of flashes. "Is it true you have a history with her? Are you two reuniting?" Security guards hustled in, attempting to keep the paparazzi at bay, but it was too late. The corridor was flooded with shouting voices, bright lights, and questions hurled like daggers. Lincoln shielded Naomi with his body, scanning for an escape route. Through the crush of people, he spotted Oliver Beck standing at a distance, his arms folded. That smug smile playing on Oliver's lips sent a chilling rush of anger through Lincoln. It looked like he was orchestrating this spectacle, ensuring the cameras were exactly where they needed to be. A guard motioned them to a side door. Lincoln gripped Naomi's hand, guiding her away from the prying lenses. They broke free into a semi-private alcove behind a tall curtain, though the reporters remained just outside, desperate for any sensational tidbit. Her pulse raced under his fingers. "What is going on?" he asked, voice low. He felt protective, outraged at the sudden ambush. "Why did you leave, and why come back now? Talk to me." "I'm sorry," Naomi managed. She glanced toward the parted curtain, where the press clamor echoed in the hall. "Oliver, he set this all up. I shouldn't have come, but I couldn't keep this secret any longer." Lincoln heard footsteps approaching, more cameras snapping. Grabbing Naomi by the shoulders, he positioned himself in a final attempt to block the lenses. The heavy footsteps grew louder. They had only seconds before security forcibly cleared the hallway. "Naomi," Lincoln pressed, "I need answers. Why did you vanish? What secret?" Her face was pale, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Somewhere behind them, a frenzy of reporters waited to pounce. "You have to know the truth," she said in a shaky whisper. "I never meant to disappear forever. I just didn't have a choice." He studied her features, trying to read between the lines. The Naomi he remembered had been focused, collected. Now, she was trembling, as though haunted by something much bigger than him or this resort. She leaned closer, her words almost lost beneath the noise outside. "Lincoln," she said, voice trembling, "it's about the time we spent together. That last night I worked for you." A deep breath then. "You have twins. They're yours." For a moment, Lincoln simply stared, his mind struggling to process what she'd just said. Twins? His? The corridor seemed to tilt, and a rush of incoherent thoughts flooded in. Reporters, cameras, his resort's grand opening. None of it mattered anymore, not in the face of this revelation. Naomi let the silence hang in the air, unsure how he'd react. Before he could gather himself, a security guard poked his head around the curtain, motioning that they had to move. The press was growing more chaotic by the second. Naomi gazed at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're about two now, healthy and beautiful. I wanted to tell you, I swear, but it got too dangerous." She inhaled unsteadily. "Please, listen. Oliver threatened me. I was afraid for them. For you. I thought disappearing was my only choice." Lincoln felt the weight of this confession slam into his chest. His eyes flickered to the curtain, beyond which camera flashes still lit the hallway. He pressed his lips together, struggling to form words, but all he could do was stare at her in shock. Naomi stepped back, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, anxiety etched into every angle of her face. "I know this is a lot, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer." Somewhere overhead, the glowing stage lights of the event flickered, their brightness reflecting off polished floors and tall glass walls. The world outside was still in the throes of celebration, but here, everything felt suspended in a single breath of disbelief and revelation. Lincoln, stunned, could barely form words. The overhead lights sparkle on his shocked expression as Naomi adds, "Please, let me explain before it's too late." Naomi's words still echoed in Lincoln's mind. He stood frozen in the narrow corridor, trying to absorb what she had just confessed. Outside, the music for the grand opening played on, but for him, the world had quieted to a single heartbeat, his own. He noticed how exhausted she looked, her eyes heavy with worry as reporters searched behind curtains and along hallways, hungry for scandal. Before anyone else could burst in on them, he took her hand and guided her away from the chaotic voices that threatened to close in. They ducked into a small lounge reserved for VIP guests, its lights low and discreet. The hum of a nearby ice machine and the distant pulsing of bass music were the only sounds. Naomi stepped a few paces ahead of Lincoln, then turned to face him. Her chin trembled, as though the effort of keeping herself composed was fraying at the edges. "You owe me an explanation. Now," Lincoln said, finally finding his voice. A note of hurt rang through it, despite his attempt to sound firm. Naomi exhaled shakily. "I do. I know. Lincoln, I'm so sorry." He braced a hand against the wall, drawing in a breath. The plush carpet underfoot did little to muffle the tension in the room. "You can't just drop a bomb like that, twins, and expect me to swallow it without any warning. You vanished. You disappeared." Naomi crossed her arms, hugging herself as if she were cold. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm here to make it right. You have every right to be furious." She paused, glancing at the door behind him. "But please understand, I didn't have a choice. I wasn't just afraid. I was threatened." "By Oliver?" Lincoln asked, his eyes narrowing. The name felt like poison on his tongue. "He was there tonight, lurking around, looking all too proud of himself." She nodded. "He found out I was pregnant before I even had the courage to tell you. He made it clear that if I stayed in touch with you, he would make my life hell, or worse." A flicker of rage crossed Lincoln's face. He remembered Oliver's smug expression at the beach, the way he always seemed to orchestrate misfortune behind the scenes. "You should have told me," he managed, trying to keep his voice from rising. "I would have handled him." Naomi looked down, her hands clasped together. "I was scared. Oliver is cruel. He had these mysterious resources, security contacts, private investigators, and he implied he had no qualms about going after my family or you. I didn't know if you'd believe me or if you'd put your business first, so I ran." Lincoln stood there, torn between anger and a rushing tide of regret. How had he not noticed Naomi's distress back then? He'd been consumed by his work, building new resorts, hosting investor meetings day and night. He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Months passed with no word. Then you show up at my biggest event? I need more than that. I need to know about the twins." Her eyes darted up at him, and for a moment, the old spark between them flickered in the dim lighting. She pulled her phone from her purse, swiped through the gallery, and held it out. Lincoln saw two toddlers with bright smiles and soft golden-brown hair. Their eyes sparkled with that unmistakable curiosity unique to young children. His breath caught. He recognized a subtle reflection of his own face, the shape of the jaw, maybe the arch of an eyebrow. They looked so full of life, so vibrant, that he felt a wave of longing wash over him. He had missed those months, their earliest steps, their first words, all of it. "Did you name them?" he asked, voice hoarse. She nodded. "Emma and Eli," she answered softly. "They're almost 2. I'm sorry, Lincoln. I never meant to keep them from you forever." Her shoulders shook as she spoke. He stared at the photo, absorbing every detail, the warm glow of sunshine across their cheeks, the ocean in the background. They looked happy, with no sign of the turmoil swirling around them. "Why did you decide to come forward tonight?" he asked gently, returning her phone. "Because I realized Oliver would keep pulling strings until it was too late," Naomi said, glancing around the lounge. "He's out to destroy you, and if he keeps using my secrets, our secrets, we'll never be free. I couldn't keep living like that. I'm so tired of running." Lincoln studied her face, remembering the determined consultant he once knew, organized, brilliant at her job, always the first to arrive and last to leave. He saw those same flickers of determination now, tempered by fear and maternal protectiveness. "And what did Oliver threaten this time?" he asked, tension wrapping itself around each syllable. A gust of warm air from the corridor rustled the lounge's curtains. Distantly, the celebratory music continued, as though mocking the confrontation here in the shadows. "He wanted me to ruin your opening," Naomi said quietly. "The final blow would be revealing that you fathered twins and turned your back on us. Which of course isn't the real story, but he knows how to spin it. I couldn't go through with his demands. Instead, I came to warn you." Lincoln's fist curled at his side. The idea that Oliver had used Naomi's fear as a weapon set his pulse racing. "I'm glad you told me," he said, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced down at the photo of the twins still visible on her phone screen, a pang of wonder and regret surging in him. Before either of them could speak again, the lounge door cracked open. Olivia peeked inside, tension etched across her face. Her eyes flicked from Naomi to Lincoln. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the press is waiting. They're already speculating about some big scoop. Investors are starting to ask questions too. We need you out there." Lincoln shot a fleeting look at Naomi. Anger and worry pulsed through him in equal measure. He had to keep the situation under control, both to protect Naomi and the children, and to stop Oliver from doing more damage. Still, the realization of his sudden fatherhood overshadowed everything. So many thoughts collided in his head. How would he protect them? How could he ever make up for lost time? He turned to Olivia. "Give me a minute," he said, noting the urgent look in her eye. She nodded, stepping out, but her posture told him they couldn't stall much longer. When he turned back to Naomi, her face was heavy with unspoken emotions. "Are you going to confront Oliver?" she asked. "Not here, not now. I need more information first," he said, lowering his voice to a hushed tone. "I won't let him bully you. But if we create a scene tonight, it plays right into his hands. Let me handle the press. Calm things down." He paused, the weight of his new reality settling over him like a storm cloud. "I have so many questions about Eli and Emma. I want to know everything. But I have to do this first." Naomi nodded, swallowing back tears. She slipped her phone into her bag. "I understand. Just, please be careful. Oliver is capable of more than you think." The lounge door swung open again as one of the security team poked his head in. "Sir, we need you outside," he said firmly, voice brimming with urgency. Lincoln squeezed Naomi's arm gently, trying to convey more comfort than he felt. "Stay here for now, or find a quiet spot. Try not to be seen by the cameras. I'll come back as soon as I can." She nodded. Without warning, a strong wave of emotion rushed over her, and for a second, it looked as if she might throw herself into Lincoln's arms. Instead, she held back and turned, pushing aside the sense of longing that trembled in the space between them. As she slipped out another exit, he watched her go, heart clenched with a newfound protectiveness. A swirl of staff members, event planners, and cameras awaited him on the other side of the door, but all he could picture were the faces of those two little children. He drew in a bracing breath. Tonight was about more than just a grand opening. It was the start of a battle. For truth, for the safety of two innocent kids, and for something even deeper he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. With a final glance at the lounge's dim interior, he headed into the corridor, greeted by a wall of questions from the press. Photographers snapped pictures relentlessly, and reporters elbowed each other for a better angle. He held up a hand to keep them at bay, forcing a cordial smile. Olivia stood off to the side, holding her clipboard like a shield, her eyes wide with apprehension. The noise was deafening, the swirl of voices almost overwhelming. "Mr. Hollister, what's your relationship with the mysterious guest? Is it true you had a falling out with your former consultant? Any comment on new rumors about your personal life?" He glanced at Olivia, who shook her head slightly. There was no good way to handle these rumors yet, not until he had a plan. For the moment, he needed to buy himself time. "Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your patience," he said to the reporters, injecting a calm authority into his tone. "I'll be making a full statement soon, but in the meantime I'd like everyone to continue enjoying the festivities." The paparazzi pressed for more, but Lincoln maneuvered around them, stepping back toward the open-air platform where music still played for the invited guests. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. In that moment, he understood the monumental consequences of Naomi's revelation. Every move he made from here would have a ripple effect, not just on his company, but on the 2 small children who shared his blood. His mind was spinning with questions about them, what they liked to eat, their first words, the color of their eyes. It shocked him that he could feel so attached to these children he'd never met. Fury toward Oliver welled up, but he clenched it tight, determined not to let it show on his face. He positioned himself at the edge of the stage, forcing a confident smile as the master of ceremonies gestured for him to address the crowd. Cameras swung around to capture his every move. His heart thudded, heavy with an emotion he'd never felt at any public event before. He had built this empire with his own 2 hands, but suddenly, all of it felt insignificant compared to the thought of 2 bright-eyed toddlers who would one day look to him for guidance. Forcing himself to focus, he took the mic. Applause rippled through the air, but inside he felt only a whirl of conflicting emotions. He cleared his throat and went through the motions, thanking sponsors, praising his team for their hard work, knowing full well that the real headlines the next day would revolve around his personal life. Still, he managed to maintain composure, nodding politely at the applause, ignoring Oliver's shadow in the background. Once he finished speaking, he lowered the mic. His pulse hammered relentlessly, and he could barely remember the words he had just uttered. All he knew was that any second, a journalist would shout the question that would force him to confirm or deny everything Naomi had shared. He stepped down from the stage, glancing toward where he had last seen Oliver, but the man was nowhere in sight. Instead, Naomi's face flashed in his mind. He no longer had the luxury of living solely for business deals and expansions. Life had taken an abrupt turn, and the path he had controlled so expertly was now tangled with new responsibilities he couldn't ignore. He felt the stares of curious onlookers, the subtle hush of people noticing his unusual tension. He'd always prided himself on composure, but how could he remain calm when the future of his children, his own children, was at stake? He forced himself to lift his chin, pivoting away from the stage lights. The music still swelled behind him, and the chatter of guests floated by, yet none of it penetrated the storm swirling inside him. A tremor coursed through his body as he recognized one unchangeable fact for the first time in his life. Everything he did from now on would be for them, his twins, Emma and Eli. Lincoln stepped out to the stage, forced to act as if nothing's wrong, but his mind reels with a single transformative truth. He is a father. Lincoln returned to the stage under glittering lights, each beam dancing over the crowd gathered on the white sand. Though he managed a pleasant smile, his heart was pounding with every step he took. The microphone was still warm in his hand, but the applause that welcomed him moments before felt distant. He had just discovered he was a father, of twins, yet here he was, expected to deliver a smooth and polished address about the future of Hollister Beach Resort. His thoughts flicked between responsibility and shock, between anger at Oliver and longing to know more about his own children. Clearing his throat, he began speaking to the crowd. Polite cheers and camera flashes rippled through the twilight, punctuated by the clinking of champagne glasses. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "This resort represents a new era, not just for Hollister Enterprises, but for the families who will enjoy these shores for years to come." He forced himself to keep going, even as he scanned the rows of faces for a glimpse of Naomi. A sea breeze carried the tang of salt and the soft flutter of banners overhead. Fireworks burst behind him in a sudden explosion of color. The crowd gasped in delight, but Lincoln felt only a flicker of unease. Oliver Beck was somewhere amid this throng, whispering into influential ears, ready to undermine him at the first opportunity. And now Naomi's secret, her twins, had placed a target on both their backs. Sure enough, in the far corner of the VIP area, Lincoln spotted Oliver leaning over to speak with a certain gossip blogger he recognized from local tabloids. She wore a bright pink jacket, her phone clutched in manicured fingers, eyes lighting up at whatever Oliver was saying. Lincoln's stomach tightened. Oliver's sly grin was unmistakable, a silent promise that he would take advantage of every whisper of scandal. Meanwhile, Naomi lingered near the catering setup, half hidden behind artfully arranged platters of fruit and seafood. She kept her gaze lowered, as if hoping to remain invisible. But the guests, as polite as they were, tended to notice someone whose demeanor screamed she was trying not to be noticed. Eventually, a local journalist slid past a waiter carrying a silver tray and cornered her. Lincoln watched from the stage, heart pounding, as the journalist's questions came in rapid-fire bursts. Naomi tried to brush off the questions about her connection to Hollister Resorts, but the journalist, an eager young woman in a neat blazer, held out her tape recorder. She asked, "Weren't you once employed here? Why haven't we seen you for months?" Naomi's cheeks grew hot. She mumbled something about leaving on a personal matter, but the journalist didn't look satisfied. A half-dozen more questions were poised to erupt, and Lincoln suspected they all circled the same rumor. Who was Naomi Stone, and why was she suddenly back? When Lincoln finished his speech with a forced flourish of gratitude, the applause swept through the audience. He stepped down from the small podium. His eyes automatically found Naomi's from across the crowd. She offered him a fleeting, tense glance as though pleading for help. He offered the slightest nod in return, reassurance that he would be there for her. A new kind of protectiveness flared in him, one he never knew he was capable of. Oliver, meanwhile, raised a glass of champagne in the VIP section, flashing that ever-present smugness. "To future successes," he announced loudly enough for guests to hear. "May tonight bring revelations that shake things up." The words dripped with innuendo, and the small group around him exchanged curious or amused looks. Despite the festive atmosphere, Lincoln sensed watchers in every corner, as though the resort's perfect facade was hiding cracks ready to shatter into scandal. Behind him, Olivia stepped away from a hushed conversation with one of the PR staff. She hurried to catch up, her eyes wide. "I just heard someone mention secret children," she whispered under her breath. "One of the reporters is claiming an insider tip. Are we in trouble?" Lincoln forced a calm front, though his pulse spiked. "We'll manage. Just keep an eye out. Don't let them corner Naomi." He didn't know how else to protect Naomi from the inevitable. The secret was a ticking bomb, and Oliver was likely controlling the fuse. Moments later, a group of investors descended on Lincoln, congratulating him while fishing for reassurance. They were all polite smiles and handshakes, but he could sense their underlying concern. "We're hearing a few rumors," one man said delicately. Another added, "Just gossip, of course, but can you confirm everything's in order?" Lincoln insisted everything was fine, though anxiety prickled along his spine. He knew too well that rumors about hidden children could shake investor confidence. In their minds, unpredictability equaled risk. Trying to extricate himself, He slipped away toward a quieter section of the venue, and there, in a dim spot near the edge of the open-air reception, he found Naomi. She was standing with her arms crossed protectively, struggling to maintain composure after an overheard remark from someone in Oliver's circle. Lincoln could see the flicker of pain in her eyes, something about her disappearance, a mocking tone that suggested there was more to the story than she wanted to share. "I heard them talking," Naomi said softly, glancing at the floor as he approached. "They're mocking me, saying I faked the pregnancy or something even uglier. It's only a matter of time before they figure out the truth." He stepped closer, scanning the crowd for wandering cameras. "We'll figure out how to handle this," he promised. His voice was low but urgent. She looked up, fear plain on her face. "I've already dragged you into this mess." He shook his head, pressing a hand lightly to her shoulder. "No, this is bigger than you or me. Tell me what's going on." A tremor went through her. She pulled out her phone, tilting it so he could see a text that had just come in. "They know. The kids are in danger," it read. Lincoln felt a chill. He looked around, scanning faces for any sign of who might have sent it. This was exactly the kind of threat Oliver was capable of, vague, menacing, with a single goal: control. "Then we protect them," Lincoln said firmly. "And we protect you. I won't let anything happen to them or to you." She gave a shaky nod. For a moment, the tension between them lifted, replaced by a quiet but determined unity. Before she could respond, a sudden wave of paparazzi flooded the area, cameras held aloft. Security scrambled to hold them back, but it was too late. The luminous beams of flashbulbs streaked across the polished floors, capturing Naomi's face and Lincoln's protective posture. "Mr. Hollister, is it true you fathered twins with your former employee?" someone shouted. "Are you hiding your children from the public?" More voices piled on. "Naomi, can you confirm you're the mother of Lincoln's babies?" "Did he abandon you?" "Why the secrecy?" Naomi recoiled at the barrage, stepping behind Lincoln. He raised an arm, blocking the closest lens from her face. The reporters pressed forward, thirsting for any sensational detail. Security guards in dark suits rushed in, forming a tight line between the press and Lincoln. The scene dissolved into an explosion of camera flashes, shouts, and frantic scuffles. In the glare of it all, Oliver was nowhere to be seen, but Lincoln felt his presence like a poison in the air. Naomi's eyes brimmed with panic, her breathing quickening. He put a hand on her back, urging her to move away from the throng. "This is madness," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's exactly what he wanted." "Just keep walking," Lincoln said, guiding her out of the direct path of the cameras. An onlooker's startled cry echoed through the marble-floored corridor as the paparazzi kept pressing. Flashes continued to illuminate the tension, catching every fearful glance and every anxious step. Suddenly, a tabloid journalist pushed through the crowd, phone in hand, reading something aloud in a triumphant tone. Her words sliced through the commotion. Breaking headline: "Sources confirm Naomi Stone is the mother of Lincoln Hollister's twins." Lincoln, care to comment on these so-called illegitimate heirs? Naomi froze, caught in the crosshairs of the cameras. The color drained from her face. The swirling mass of onlookers and reporters pounced on this piece of information, demanding answers. Beyond the line of security, guests at the lavish event turned to stare. Lincoln clenched his jaw. Everything he'd tried to hold off was pouring out in a single unstoppable wave. His mind raced, searching for a way to shield Naomi from the worst of it. She looked so vulnerable. He stepped forward, prepared to confront them, to speak some half-formed truth. But the voices were too many, the lights too bright. He caught a glimpse of Olivia hovering nearby, her phone pressed to her ear, clearly attempting damage control with the press or the investors, or both. In that charged second, the world seemed to tilt. Lincoln realized that no matter how well he spoke or how carefully he managed his public image, the story had already spread. There was no denying it now, and behind it all, Oliver's looming figure, controlling the narrative, fanning the flames, relishing every second of Lincoln's unraveling. Stunned, Lincoln saw a tabloid journalist reading from a phone. Sources confirm Naomi Stone is the mother of Lincoln Hollister's twins. The world, it seems, has just found out. The word was out, and the story was everywhere. Reporters blocked the entrance to the resort, pushing microphones and cameras into the path of anyone who tried to pass. Their voices jostled in a chaotic chorus. Is it true Mr. Hollister abandoned his own children? Did he know about the twins all along? Where is the mother, and why did she hide this for so long? Flashbulbs exploded in rapid fire, illuminating a sea of questioning faces. The nighttime breeze carried the sound of urgent phone calls and hushed gossip through the palm-lined courtyard. Inside, Lincoln Hollister was desperately trying to get a handle on the situation. He had retreated to his private office, a sleek space normally reserved for quiet meetings with top-tier investors or staff. Now, it was overrun with his frantic PR team, all on their phones, issuing statements to the media and doing their best to prevent immediate financial fallout. An assistant rushed in with a printed list of investors who were either threatening to pull out or demanding reassurance that this personal scandal wouldn't tank the new resort. Investor confidence is plummeting, one of the PR specialists whispered urgently, holding a phone away from her mouth. They want an official statement from you, something that clarifies these rumors. Lincoln stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He heard every word his team said, but his mind was elsewhere. Waves of guilt, shock, and anger coursed through him. He was reeling from the sheer scale of the uproar. In a single night, the fatherhood he never knew he possessed was splashed across tabloids and news tickers. Every conversation about the twins felt like a blow to his gut, reminding him of what he'd missed, and of the threat that lurked behind this scandal. Gazing across the resort's grounds, he caught sight of Naomi in the distance, pacing near a corridor lined with photos that showcased his major milestones. A philanthropic gala here, a groundbreaking ceremony there. In each image, he wore a confident smile that spoke to his ambition. Naomi walked by them with unsteady steps, her arms folded across her chest as though protecting herself from the gazes of his past achievements. She appeared torn between finding a way out and fighting for what mattered most. Before he could go to her, his office door burst open. One of his investors, an older man in a sharp suit, stormed in, trailed by Olivia, who tried to stop him. The man glared at Lincoln. "I've just heard from a journalist that you have secret children and covered up the entire situation," he snapped, voice dripping with accusation. "I have half a mind to pull our financing immediately. Your poor personal decisions could drag all of us through the mud." Lincoln clenched his jaw. The fatherly instinct he'd only just discovered blazed through him. No, he'd had no knowledge of the twins until tonight, and the idea that he was a deadbeat dad made his blood boil. "I understand your concerns," he managed, keeping his voice level. "But I assure you, this news took me by surprise as much as anyone. Give me time to sort out the facts." The investor huffed, turning on his heel and sweeping back out the door. Olivia offered Lincoln an apologetic look, then followed, muttering something about putting out fires. Lincoln exhaled. He knew that half-truths and vague promises wouldn't suffice for long. Eventually, the full story would need to come to light. He couldn't linger in the office. Naomi needed him. Shoving aside the chaos of phone calls, he briskly walked out. Down the corridor, Naomi was staring at a picture of him cutting a ribbon at one of his earlier resorts. The bright smile on his photographed face contrasted sharply with the tension etched into his real one now. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame as if trying to understand the man in the image. Seeing her posture, so alone and cornered, stirred something deep in him. "Naomi," he said, quietly but firmly. "We need to talk, somewhere private." She nodded, releasing a shaky breath. Together they headed to a conference room just off the main hallway. Lincoln locked the door behind them for good measure. The room was spotless, with a polished oval table and high-backed chairs meant for board meetings. not emotional confrontations. Outside the frosted glass, frantic shadows passed by, staff running around, media requesting interviews, security guiding guests out. Inside, there was only the hum of air conditioning and the tension that clung to them both. Lincoln didn't bother sitting down. "Why didn't you tell me about the twins sooner?" he asked, frustration slipping into his voice. "I keep asking myself how this could have been avoided if you had just come to me." Naomi lowered her head, tears threatening to fall. "Because I was scared you'd choose your company or your reputation over two children you didn't even know. Oliver was breathing down my neck, saying you'd turn against me, that you'd come after me legally if I caused a scandal. I believed him." "Oliver," Lincoln repeated bitterly. Of course, it all circled back to his conniving rival. "He threatened you?" She nodded, stepping closer and pulling out her phone. "He, or someone under his payroll, has been sending messages for months, demanding updates on me, on the children, ordering me to keep my mouth shut about the real father. The threats ranged from blackmail to harming the twins if I ever stepped out of line." Lincoln's chest tightened. He felt the rage gather at the base of his throat. Naomi tapped her screen and showed him a series of text messages. They were short, ominous lines. "Remember who's in charge. Don't forget what we discussed. You'll regret it if you stay in contact with Hollister." Each message was from an unknown number, but the context was clear. He glanced up at her face, reading the guilt and fear that shone there. "I would never have abandoned you," he said quietly, anger giving way to heartbreak. "I had a right to know." Naomi sniffed back tears. "I see that now. Maybe I should have trusted you, but Oliver's intimidation was relentless." The door opened without warning, and there stood Oliver Beck himself, leaning casually against the frame. He was immaculate in a tailored suit, his dark hair combed back in that practiced style of a man who reveled in attention. His smug smile sent chills rippling through Lincoln. Without stepping fully into the room, Oliver let his gaze flick from Naomi to Lincoln. "Pardon my interruption," he drawled, "but I couldn't resist seeing the two of you mid-confession. Quite a dramatic scene. I almost wish I had brought a camera crew." Lincoln felt his anger flare into fury. "Get out!" he snapped. The sight of Oliver's smugness, especially after all the threats Naomi had endured, was too much. Oliver lifted a brow. "Or what? You'll cause a scene? We're in your brand new resort, remember? The world's press is just outside that door. They're hungry for any juicy quote to confirm you're the father who left Naomi Stone high and dry." Naomi shrank back, bitterness flooding her voice. "You never cared about me or the children. You just used them as leverage to ruin Lincoln." Oliver shrugged. "Business can be nasty when personal secrets come to light," he said. "Don't take it too personally. It's all about the upper hand, and you gave me the perfect ammunition." Lincoln lunged forward, unable to hold back the urge to physically wipe the smirk off Oliver's face, but Oliver sidestepped, and security guards, stationed outside for protection, rushed in. They grabbed Lincoln's arms, preventing an altercation from spiraling out of control. Oliver simply chuckled, stepping away from the potential blow with infuriating ease. In that moment, Naomi's fear crystallized. She realized that everything, the press storm, the public humiliation, the shouts of condemnation calling Lincoln a deadbeat dad, had been orchestrated by Oliver. Her stomach churned as it all clicked into place. The well-timed leaks to gossip blogs, the infiltration of the event by paparazzi, the swirling rumors that singled her out in the crowd. He'd planned each step to inflict maximum damage. Just then, Olivia burst into the conference room, breathless and red-faced. "Lincoln," she gasped, "social media is on fire. People are calling you a fraud, and half our backers want out unless you clear this up immediately." Oliver gave a theatrical sigh of disappointment. "Such a pity, Hollister," he said softly, stepping aside as if he were granting them space to salvage the situation. "I had hoped you'd keep your temper, but I suppose it's too late for that now." He flashed a final grin at Naomi, who refused to meet his eye, and strolled out as casually as he had appeared, leaving the door swinging behind him. In his wake, Lincoln and Naomi were left facing each other in a swirl of heartbreak and anger. The phone on the conference table buzzed. Olivia, still out of breath, rattled off a string of updates. Investors demanding immediate statements, news outlets requesting interviews, staff unsure how to handle the meltdown. It was a storm of phone calls, emails, and urgent knocks on the locked door, all demanding a resolution that neither Naomi nor Lincoln could neatly provide. At last, Naomi couldn't bear the tension any longer. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she pushed past Lincoln, making for the exit. He hurried after her, calling her name, but she was too overwrought to stop. She made it out of the conference room and into the long corridor, brushing off the sympathetic looks of employees and swerving around cameras. He caught up with her just as she passed through a side door that led toward the rear veranda. Rain-scented wind whipped across the manicured landscaping. The night sky had darkened, clouds rolling in to smother the stars. It felt like the entire day's chaos had conjured this storm, as if nature itself was unsettled. Lincoln tried to comfort Naomi, but she stood there trembling, gazing out at the horizon. Their words seemed small against the backdrop of the rumbling thunder in the distance. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "I never wanted this to happen, but please don't run away again." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't want to," she said softly, "but I have to keep them safe." Before Lincoln could reply, a jagged fork of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a crash of thunder that vibrated in their chests. The wind gusted, sending palm fronds rattling, announcing the storm's imminent arrival. Lincoln remained rooted on the veranda, shirt collar flapping, as Naomi stepped inside to find refuge. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced down, tension radiating through him. On the screen was a text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what else you've inherited." Lightning flashed across the dark sky as Lincoln stood on the resort's balcony, phone in hand, reading a cryptic text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what else you've inherited." Morning light crept into the resort's corridors, softening the harshness of the previous night's storm. Lincoln Hollister stood near a tall window in the lobby, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. The anonymous text he'd received hours earlier, "You have no idea what else you've inherited," still pulsed with menace in his mind. Dawn revealed evidence of the commotion from the night before. Scuff marks on polished floors where paparazzi had scrambled, and faint traces of muddy footprints outside the glass doors where security had ushered them away. The chaos might have calmed, but the implications were only intensifying. He scrolled through news headlines, each one more sensational than the last. Magnate's secret twins, Hollister resorts, scandal deepens. Billionaire dad or deadbeat, Hollister under fire. Flicking his gaze over each title, he felt his shoulders tense. His private life had become public domain overnight, and Oliver Beck, that smug face lurking behind every cunning move, was nowhere to be seen, but certainly orchestrating from afar. A sudden beep caught Lincoln's attention. He glanced at the screen. More investor emails, each one demanding answers. He clenched his jaw, closing the window on his phone. Standing around wouldn't fix anything. This wasn't the time to wallow in shock. He had a business to protect, and more importantly, a family he had just discovered. In a nearby guest suite, Naomi awoke to the muffled sound of staff wheeling carts through the hallway. She sat up in bed, blinking away the memories of the past 24 hours. A heavy weight pressed down on her chest as she reached for her phone. The first thing she saw was a flurry of notifications, messages from acquaintances, a few from unknown numbers, and several news articles about Lincoln's secret fatherhood. Each headline seemed determined to paint him as a ruthless businessman who'd kept his own children hidden for years. Her stomach churned with guilt. Had her silence, born from fear, allowed Oliver to take the narrative into his own hands? She slid off the bed and padded over to the small window, peering down at the resort's courtyard. Gardeners trimmed hedges in a polite hush, as if no crisis had erupted. The morning sun glinted against the bright landscaping, mocking the turmoil unraveling inside her. She had to do something. Oliver's threats had held her captive long enough. Meanwhile, across town, Oliver Beck took the stage at a hastily arranged press conference. The camera lights reflected off his precisely tailored suit, and he held up a stack of papers with a theatrical flourish. "These documents," he announced, his voice carrying a note of triumph, "detail the inadequate working conditions at the Hollister Beach Resort construction site. Workers were overworked and underpaid. Some claim to have been denied basic protections. It's time the public knows." He smirked, ignoring the sharp looks from a couple of local reporters who suspected his motives. One woman raised her hand, asking, "Mr. Beck, are you implying you have first-hand knowledge of these conditions?" Oliver spread his hands in a show of mock concern. "I'm only here to ensure justice. You'll have to ask Mr. Hollister why he cut corners." The press conference crackled with flashbulbs, fueling speculation that Lincoln was not only a father who'd neglected his children, but a dishonest CEO exploiting his workers. By mid-morning, Lincoln's office bustled with tension. His PR team had prepared statements dismissing Oliver's allegations as baseless, but investors weren't so easily reassured. Some threatened lawsuits, others demanded immediate proof that all labor had been fair and above board. Lincoln rubbed the bridge of his nose, frustration building. He turned to Olivia, who stood next to him, scanning through binders thick with contractor agreements. "We need a paper trail to show everything was done properly," Lincoln said, voice low and urgent. "We're combing through the documents," Olivia replied, "but it's a lot to sift through. We might need extra eyes." That was when Naomi stepped in, the sweet key still in her hand. Her posture was uncertain, but her gaze was resolute. "I can help," she said softly. "I worked on financial oversight when I was consulting. I know exactly what to look for." Lincoln's staff exchanged hesitant glances. Many remembered Naomi from her brief tenure before she'd vanished. Lincoln nodded, wanting her on board. It was time to unite. Naomi moved to one of the desks, flipping open a binder containing building permits, contractor details, payment logs. "Oliver is framing you," she said quietly, skimming the pages with quick, decisive motions. "He's done something like this before, diverting funds to fake labor claims, forging signatures. If he's repeating old tricks, it'll show somewhere." Outside the office, a discreet security guard poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt," he muttered, looking uneasy, "but you might want to check the staff offices. We caught someone lurking around, rifling through files." Lincoln shot Naomi a concerned look, then hurried down the corridor with her at his side. The staff offices were a cluster of smaller rooms where day-to-day administrative tasks were handled. Desks were neatly arranged with computers and stacks of paperwork. But one desk stood in disarray, folders overturned, documents scattered across the floor. A wide filing cabinet bore marks of forced entry, its lock hanging crooked. Naomi knelt down to gather some of the scattered pages. She noticed certain documents missing entire sections, pages torn or removed altogether. The employees nearby wore alarmed expressions. A few admitted they'd seen a stranger slip out seconds before security arrived. It confirmed Naomi's suspicion that Oliver had eyes and ears everywhere. He'd likely dispatched someone to tamper with the evidence that Lincoln's team could use to disprove his smear campaign. Lincoln surveyed the damage with grim determination. "We have to assume anything incriminating Oliver has been removed," he said. "He's playing dirty and we need to step up our game." Naomi closed the nearest folder, remembering conversations she'd had with Oliver in her consulting days. "He used to brag about his creative accounting when it suited him," she told Lincoln, her voice carrying a note of regret. "I never asked too many questions, which is on me. But I recall vague mentions of transferring funds in ways that wouldn't show up in normal audits." Olivia joined them, shaking her head at the ransacked office. "So Oliver's trying to position you as unethical when he's the one manipulating these so-called facts?" she asked, scanning the ruined locks and scattered papers. Naomi handed her a sheaf of documents. "Yes, and more. He threatened me precisely because I knew enough about his methods to blow the whistle. If we can find that evidence, we can expose him. But we have to work fast." In a quieter corner, the group, Lincoln, Naomi, Olivia, and 2 trusted employees, convened around a small table. The overhead light flickered softly, casting an anxious glow on their determined faces. Lincoln pressed his knuckles to his temple, feeling the pressure build from every angle: fatherhood, scandal, sabotage, and a personal vendetta that had now become blatantly clear. Naomi looked over at him, guilt lining her features. "I never wanted any of this, Lincoln. If I'd just told you about the twins right away, Oliver wouldn't have gotten such a strong hold on me." He reached out to gently touch her arm. "None of us can change the past," he said, voice subdued. "But we can do something about now." A flicker of warmth passed between them, a moment that acknowledged both the burden they carried and the closeness that danger was forging. Naomi dug her phone from her purse, swiping to a collection of photos and short video clips. She hesitated, then showed Lincoln a short video of 2 little ones at a beach somewhere, building sand castles and shrieking with laughter every time a wave crept close. Emma and Eli, faces bright with joy. It was as though, for an instant, the rest of the world disappeared, leaving only Lincoln's awe at this new reality of fatherhood. "They look so happy," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I want to meet them properly. I want to be in their lives." Naomi nodded, her eyes misting, and he recognized how much she wanted that too. Before the moment could deepen further, a staff member rushed in, breathless. "Sir, we've got a tip about Oliver. Something about an abandoned property he's been using. Could be where he keeps personal ledgers or older records. If that's true, maybe we'll find the evidence we need." Lincoln and Naomi exchanged glances. Olivia set down the papers she'd been sifting through. "If we can get our hands on documents that prove Oliver's fraud, we can flip this story around," she said. "The media loves a twist, and nothing sells better than the downfall of a shady businessman trying to destroy an innocent family." The small alliance agreed. They would investigate this lead. It was risky. Oliver was clearly capable of intimidation and data tampering, but they were out of options. If they didn't find concrete proof, Oliver's narrative would gain permanent traction, and the scandal about Lincoln's supposed wrongdoing would overshadow everything else. "Let's gather what we can," Lincoln said, rallying the group. "We'll plan how to get into that property safely, but we can't wait too long. Oliver's probably expecting us to move." Naomi, determined, squared her shoulders. "We'll do it, for the sake of the twins and for us." They nodded, a quiet resolve binding them together. For the first time, Lincoln felt a surge of purpose beyond personal vengeance. He needed to clear his name, secure his business, and protect Naomi and his children from further harm. That meant outmaneuvering Oliver at his own game, gathering solid proof rather than relying on half measures. A hush fell as they each took a role. Olivia to handle outside research and keep the PR front under control, the staff members to track down any missing papers from the rummaged files, Naomi to recall every detail from her consulting work with Oliver, and Lincoln to lead the charge, finally ready to fight back with every resource at his disposal. As they prepared to move out, Naomi's phone buzzed with a new text message. She glanced at the screen, her face draining of color. Wordlessly, she showed it to Lincoln. The text was stark and chilling. "Stay away from that property, or your children pay the price." They waited for nightfall to cloak them. Lincoln drove, his hands tight on the steering wheel as he guided the sleek SUV down an unlit road on the outskirts of town. In the passenger seat, Naomi clutched a file of notes they had gathered, each page potentially a clue to Oliver's hidden misdeeds. Two of Lincoln's most trusted security staff sat in the back, scanning the dark horizon for any sign they were followed. The tension inside the vehicle was palpable, every breath charged with anticipation. Naomi glanced at the text on her phone one more time. "Stay away from that property, or your children pay the price." The words sent a chill through her every time she read them. Yet here she was, ignoring the threat, driven by the urgent need to uncover whatever records Oliver had stashed away. A flicker of guilt tugged at her. Was she endangering Emma and Eli by coming here? But if Oliver wasn't stopped, he would never let them live in peace. She clung to that belief for courage. The headlights revealed a chain-link fence and a rusted sign half buried in weeds. Beyond it stood a crumbling warehouse, its windows boarded up, the entire structure looking one good storm away from total collapse. Lincoln slowed the SUV, scanning for any movement. A single light glimmered inside, faint and intermittent, like an old bulb about to burn out. He pulled over a short distance away, cutting the engine. The group exited silently, shoes crunching on gravel. Crickets hummed in the damp night air. In the distance, the glow of city lights flickered, but here they were cloaked in shadow. One of the security men motioned for everyone to remain quiet. They crept toward a gap in the fence where someone had clearly ripped the chain open. The swirling wind carried the scent of rust and old motor oil. Naomi's heart pounded as she edged inside. Her every sense was on alert. 1,000 questions rattled through her mind. Was Oliver here? Had he set a trap? But her resolve was firm. If they found any hint of money laundering or false contracts in Oliver's old files, they could weaken his grip on the scandal threatening Lincoln's resort, and Emma and Eli would be safer for it. They slid along the side of the building, stepping carefully to avoid glass shards. Naomi caught sight of a door that hung half open, one hinge broken. Dark shapes loomed in the corners, could be crates or leftover debris. Lincoln flicked on a small flashlight, keeping the beam low. Naomi leaned in to whisper, "Let's check the main room first. Oliver might have stored records in boxes or cabinets." He nodded, leading the way. The security staff followed, scanning each shadow. It was silent inside, save for their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Gutted walls exposed rusting beams overhead, and a musty odor clung to the stale air. Rainwater dripping through a crack in the roof splashed into a puddle that had formed across the floor. In the middle of what once might have been an office or workshop space, they found a row of battered metal filing cabinets. Each was scratched and dented, the cabinet doors barely on their tracks. Naomi opened one drawer gingerly. It slid with a screech, revealing a mishmash of documents. She exhaled, relief and apprehension mingling. They might have found what they came for, but they'd have to be quick. Lincoln knelt beside her, shining his flashlight onto the papers. Old receipts, worthless memos, canceled checks. Then, in the back of a lower drawer, Naomi noticed a thick folder stamped with the name of one of Oliver's shell companies, a name she remembered from her early consulting days. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. Inside were scanned contracts and suspicious invoices. Each page reeked of misappropriations, with sums that didn't match stated expenses, payments made to cryptic third parties. Her eyes darted across the numbers. This was exactly the kind of dirty ledger they needed to undermine Oliver's claims of Lincoln's unethical practices. "Jackpot," she whispered, holding the folder up. Lincoln scanned the first few pages, tension easing from his shoulders. "We can tie these transactions to Oliver," he said in a breathless hush. "They show he's been funneling money, maybe even paying people to fabricate stories about Hollister resorts." One of the security staff, a broad-shouldered man named Bryce, motioned for them to stay low. He said softly, "I hear something." They froze, hearts pounding. Sure enough, faint footsteps echoed from somewhere near the warehouse entrance. Lincoln quickly shut off his flashlight. The group crouched among the scattered boxes, hidden in the gloom. The footsteps grew louder. A second later, A harsh beam of light raked across the space. Naomi held her breath, heart hammering. She dared a glance and glimpsed two figures stepping inside, men in dark clothing scanning their surroundings. One muttered into a phone, though the words were too muffled to make out. In the scant illumination, Naomi recognized the silhouette of the man who'd once confronted her in a resort hallway, a known associate of Oliver's, one of his so-called security contractors. Her pulse quickened. They were cornered in this old, rotting building, and these men likely had orders to destroy evidence or deal with trespassers. Lincoln motioned for Naomi and the others to back away, deeper into the shadows. She clutched the incriminating folder, pressing it against her chest, desperate not to lose it. The men's flashlight beams swept the floor, passing just inches from where she knelt. Her mouth went dry, every nerve on edge, praying the minimal cover would be enough. One of the intruders walked past the row of cabinets, nudging the metal drawers with his boot. "Check if they found anything," he muttered to his partner. Naomi could almost feel the tension in the air, so thick she imagined the pair could hear her heartbeat. As the men approached the battered filing cabinets, Naomi slipped quietly behind a pile of crates, trying to stay invisible. Across the aisle, Lincoln and Bryce crouched behind an overturned desk. The second guard, Santos, edged to the far end of the room, hoping to create a distraction if needed. Suddenly, the intruder gave the filing cabinet a harsh kick, toppling it and sending a cascade of papers fluttering across the concrete. His flashlight swept down, revealing empty folders. He swore under his breath, rummaging through the mess. Naomi watched, breath tight, aware the stolen folder in her arms was exactly what they were after. They'd notice its absence soon enough. The first man spat a curse. "They've already been here," he hissed. "Get rid of them if they're still around." Adrenaline surged in Naomi's veins. She locked eyes with Lincoln across the gloom. They had to escape before these goons tore the place apart. Lincoln nodded once, signaling for Bryce to move. In a burst of controlled motion, Bryce sprang from behind the desk, grabbing the closer intruder in a chokehold. The man let out a strangled grunt. His partner snapped around, raising a weapon. Santos lunged from the opposite side, knocking the gun aside before it could fire. A frantic scuffle ensued, the sounds of fists meeting bodies echoing off the concrete. Naomi clung to the folder, heart pounding. She saw Lincoln get to his feet, rushing to help Bryce subdue the first intruder. The beam of a dropped flashlight skipped across the floor, illuminating pockets of dust. Naomi crouched lower, bracing herself, as the second assailant threw a punch at Santos's jaw. Santos reeled but managed to drive his shoulder into the man's midsection, knocking him off balance. The intruders realized they were outnumbered. One spat, "We'll be back with reinforcements." In a frenzy, they yanked free from the scuffle, ignoring the potential for more violence in favor of a quick retreat. Bryce lunged to grab one's collar, but the man slipped out, darting through the open door. Santos tried to chase them but halted at the entrance, peering into the night. It was too risky to follow. The men's footsteps faded into the darkness beyond the fence, leaving behind the hollow echo of their threats. Naomi exhaled a shaky breath, easing her grip on the precious folder. Lincoln bent to retrieve the fallen flashlight, shining it on the battered faces of his guards. "You both okay?" he asked, voice taut with concern. Bryce nodded, massaging his shoulder. Santos spat blood onto the floor but gave a thumbs up. Naomi emerged from behind the crates, heart still in her throat. "We need to leave. They'll definitely come back," she said, her voice unsteady. Lincoln agreed, gesturing for them to hurry. Holding onto the folder as if it were gold, Naomi trailed behind the security team. They navigated the debris-strewn floor, heading out the same broken door they'd come in. Outside, the night felt cooler, like a sudden rush of fresh air after being suffocated. The wind rustled through nearby bushes, and an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. They hurried past the chain-link fence. The SUV waited where they'd left it, its dark exterior blending into the moonless sky. Santos hopped in first to start the engine, scanning the rearview mirror in case Oliver's henchman had circled back. Lincoln helped Naomi into the passenger seat, then climbed behind the wheel. He pressed the push-button start, and the SUV roared to life. Gravel sprayed as they peeled away from the warehouse, hearts still racing. Inside, nobody spoke at first, each one reeling from the close call and the surge of relief at getting out unscathed. After a few minutes, Bryce cleared his throat. "We got something, right?" he asked, glancing at Naomi's lap. The folder lay there, corners bent from the struggle, a sign of how fiercely she'd protected it. She nodded, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Evidence that Oliver's forging records to sabotage Lincoln, paying people to lie," Naomi said, voice hushed with both triumph and anxiety. She flipped the folder open, scanning the top page by the light of the car's overhead lamp. This could ruin him, or at least back him into a corner where he can't spin his lies anymore. Lincoln flexed his hands on the steering wheel, tension easing just a fraction. The night stretched out ahead as the SUV sped back toward the city lights. Though his shirt was torn at the shoulder and Naomi's hair was disheveled from hiding behind boxes, they both wore the same look of cautious relief. They had something tangible now, something they could use to push back against Oliver's vicious campaign. As they neared the resort, city lamps illuminated the tension lingering on Naomi's face. She swallowed hard, turning to Lincoln. "They nearly took it from us," she said, voice shaking slightly. "We got lucky, but if we don't move quickly, Oliver could destroy any remaining evidence." Lincoln nodded, pulling into the resort's parking area. "We'll keep this safe. First thing tomorrow, we figure out the next move. For now, get some rest." Bryce and Santos got out first, scanning the perimeter for suspicious figures. Naomi opened her door. They waited for nightfall to cloak them. Lincoln drove, his hands tight on the steering wheel as he guided the sleek SUV down an unlit road on the outskirts of town. In the passenger seat, Naomi clutched a file of notes they had gathered, each page potentially a clue to Oliver's hidden misdeeds. Two of Lincoln's most trusted security staff sat in the back, scanning the dark horizon for any sign they were followed. The tension inside the vehicle was palpable, every breath charged with anticipation. Naomi glanced at the text on her phone one more time. "Stay away from that property, or your children pay the price." The words sent a chill through her every time she read them. Yet here she was, ignoring the threat, driven by the urgent need to uncover whatever records Oliver had stashed away. A flicker of guilt tugged at her. Was she endangering Emma and Eli by coming here? But if Oliver wasn't stopped, he would never let them live in peace. She clung to that belief for courage. The headlights revealed a chain-link fence and a rusted sign half buried in weeds. Beyond it stood a crumbling warehouse, its windows boarded up, the entire structure looking one good storm away from total collapse. Lincoln slowed the SUV, scanning for any movement. A single light glimmered inside, faint and intermittent, like an old bulb about to burn out. He pulled over a short distance away, cutting the engine. The group exited silently, shoes crunching on gravel. Crickets hummed in the damp night air. In the distance, the glow of city lights flickered, but here, they were cloaked in shadow. One of the security men motioned for everyone to remain quiet. They crept toward a gap in the fence where someone had clearly ripped the chain open. The swirling wind carried the scent of rust and old motor oil. Naomi's heart pounded as she edged inside. Her every sense was on alert. 1,000 questions rattled through her mind. Was Oliver here? Had he set a trap? But her resolve was firm. If they found any hint of money laundering or false contracts in Oliver's old files, they could weaken his grip on the scandal threatening Lincoln's resort, and Emma and Eli would be safer for it. They slid along the side of the building, stepping carefully to avoid glass shards. Naomi caught sight of a door that hung half open, one hinge broken. Dark shapes loomed in the corners, could be crates or leftover debris. Lincoln flicked on a small flashlight, keeping the beam low. Naomi leaned in to whisper, "Let's check the main room first." Oliver might have stored records in boxes or cabinets. He nodded, leading the way. The security staff followed, scanning each shadow. It was silent inside, save for their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Gutted walls exposed rusting beams overhead, and a musty odor clung to the stale air. Rainwater dripping through a crack in the roof splashed into a puddle that had formed across the floor. In the middle of what once might have been an office or workshop space, they found a row of battered metal filing cabinets. Each was scratched and dented, the cabinet doors barely on their tracks. Naomi opened one drawer gingerly. It slid with a screech, revealing a mishmash of documents. She exhaled, relief and apprehension mingling. They might have found what they came for, but they'd have to be quick. Lincoln knelt beside her, shining his flashlight onto the papers. Old receipts, worthless memos, canceled checks. Then, in the back of a lower drawer, Naomi noticed a thick folder stamped with the name of one of Oliver's shell companies, a name she remembered from her early consulting days. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. Inside were scanned contracts and suspicious invoices. Each page reeked of misappropriations, with sums that didn't match stated expenses, payments made to cryptic third parties. Her eyes darted across the numbers. This was exactly the kind of dirty ledger they needed to undermine Oliver's claims of Lincoln's unethical practices. "Jackpot," she whispered, holding the folder up. Lincoln scanned the first few pages, tension easing from his shoulders. "We can tie these transactions to Oliver," he said in a breathless hush. "They show he's been funneling money, maybe even paying people to fabricate stories about Hollister resorts." One of the security staff, a broad-shouldered man named Bryce, motioned for them to stay low. He said softly, "I hear something." They froze, hearts pounding. Sure enough, faint footsteps echoed from somewhere near the warehouse entrance. Lincoln quickly shut off his flashlight. The group crouched among the scattered boxes, hidden in the gloom. The footsteps grew louder. A second later, a harsh beam of light raked across the space. Naomi held her breath, heart hammering. She dared a glance and glimpsed two figures stepping inside, men in dark clothing scanning their surroundings. One muttered into a phone, though the words were too muffled to make out. In the scant illumination, Naomi recognized the silhouette of the man who'd once confronted her in a resort hallway, a known associate of Oliver's, one of his so-called security contractors. Her pulse quickened. They were cornered in this old, rotting building, and these men likely had orders to destroy evidence or deal with trespassers. Lincoln motioned for Naomi and the others to back away, deeper into the shadows. She clutched the incriminating folder, pressing it against her chest, desperate not to lose it. The men's flashlight beams swept the floor, passing just inches from where she knelt. Her mouth went dry, every nerve on edge, praying the minimal cover would be enough. One of the intruders walked past the row of cabinets, nudging the metal drawers with his boot. "Check if they found anything," he muttered to his partner. Naomi could almost feel the tension in the air, so thick she imagined the pair could hear her heartbeat. As the men approached the battered filing cabinets, Naomi slipped quietly behind a pile of crates, trying to stay invisible. Across the aisle, Lincoln and Bryce crouched behind an overturned desk. The second guard, Santos, edged to the far end of the room, hoping to create a distraction if needed. Suddenly, the intruder gave the filing cabinet a harsh kick, toppling it and sending a cascade of papers fluttering across the concrete. His flashlight swept down, revealing empty folders. He swore under his breath, rummaging through the mess. Naomi watched, breath tight, aware the stolen folder in her arms was exactly what they were after. They'd notice its absence soon enough. The first man spat a curse. "They've already been here," he hissed. "Get rid of them if they're still around." Adrenaline surged in Naomi's veins. She locked eyes with Lincoln across the gloom. They had to escape before these goons tore the place apart. Lincoln nodded once, signaling for Bryce to move. In a burst of controlled motion, Bryce sprang from behind the desk, grabbing the closer intruder in a chokehold. The man let out a strangled grunt. His partner snapped around, raising a weapon. Santos lunged from the opposite side, knocking the gun aside before it could fire. A frantic scuffle ensued, the sounds of fists meeting bodies echoing off the concrete. Naomi clung to the folder, heart pounding. She saw Lincoln get to his feet, rushing to help Bryce subdue the first intruder. The beam of a dropped flashlight skipped across the floor, illuminating pockets of dust. Naomi crouched lower, bracing herself, as the second assailant threw a punch at Santos's jaw. Santos reeled but managed to drive his shoulder into the man's midsection, knocking him off balance. The intruders realized they were outnumbered. One spat, "We'll be back with reinforcements." In a frenzy, they yanked free from the scuffle, ignoring the potential for more violence in favor of a quick retreat. Bryce lunged to grab one's collar, but the man slipped out, darting through the open door. Santos tried to chase them but halted at the entrance, peering into the night. It was too risky to follow. The men's footsteps faded into the darkness beyond the fence, leaving behind the hollow echo of their threats. Naomi exhaled a shaky breath, easing her grip on the precious folder. Lincoln bent to retrieve the fallen flashlight, shining it on the battered faces of his guards. "You both okay?" he asked, voice taut with concern. Bryce nodded, massaging his shoulder. Santos spat blood onto the floor, but gave a thumbs up. Naomi emerged from behind the crates, heart still in her throat. "We need to leave. They'll definitely come back," she said, her voice unsteady. Lincoln agreed, gesturing for them to hurry. Holding onto the folder as if it were gold, Naomi trailed behind the security team. They navigated the debris-strewn floor, heading out the same broken door they'd come in. Outside, the night felt cooler, like a sudden rush of fresh air after being suffocated. The wind rustled through nearby bushes, and an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. They hurried past the chain-link fence. The SUV waited where they'd left it, its dark exterior blending into the moonless sky. Santos hopped in first to start the engine, scanning the rearview mirror in case Oliver's henchman had circled back. Lincoln helped Naomi into the passenger seat, then climbed behind the wheel. He pressed the push-button start, and the SUV roared to life. Gravel sprayed as they peeled away from the warehouse, hearts still racing. Inside, nobody spoke at first, each one reeling from the close call and the surge of relief at getting out unscathed. After a few minutes, Bryce cleared his throat. "We got something, right?" he asked, glancing at Naomi's lap. The folder lay there, corners bent from the struggle, a sign of how fiercely she'd protected it. She nodded, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Evidence that Oliver's forging records to sabotage Lincoln, paying people to lie," Naomi said, voice hushed with both triumph and anxiety. She flipped the folder open, scanning the top page by the light of the car's overhead lamp. This could ruin him, or at least back him into a corner where he can't spin his lies anymore. Lincoln flexed his hands on the steering wheel, tension easing just a fraction. The night stretched out ahead as the SUV sped back toward the city lights. Though his shirt was torn at the shoulder and Naomi's hair was disheveled from hiding behind boxes, they both wore the same look of cautious relief. They had something tangible now, something they could use to push back against Oliver's vicious campaign. As they neared the resort, city lamps illuminated the tension lingering on Naomi's face. She swallowed hard, turning to Lincoln. "They nearly took it from us," she said, voice shaking slightly. "We got lucky, but if we don't move quickly, Oliver could destroy any remaining evidence." Lincoln nodded, pulling into the resort's parking area. "We'll keep this safe. First thing tomorrow, we figure out the next move. For now, get some rest." Bryce and Santos got out first, scanning the perimeter for suspicious figures. Naomi opened her door, gingerly holding the battered folder to her chest. Once they reached Lincoln's car, he insisted on escorting her safely. She slumped against the vehicle, breathing heavily. At last, she allowed herself to feel the enormity of the night, the fear, the confrontation, and the hope sparked by their discovery. She clutched the folder, her hand shaking slightly. "We have enough to point fingers at Oliver," she murmured, looking up at Lincoln through strands of messy hair. "But it's not enough to bring him down." Her voice carried a mixture of resolve and frustration. She glanced at him, eyes full of the question that weighed on her mind. "What do we do now?" Lincoln took a deep breath and leaned back against the SUV, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The night's confrontation had left him more alert than ever. In the distance, the first faint streaks of dawn crept along the horizon, ushering in another day that promised no reprieve. Naomi pressed the battered folder to her chest, still trembling from the close call. The question she'd asked, "What do we do now?" hung in the air, awaiting an answer neither one felt fully prepared to give. They exchanged a long look before heading inside. Daylight was just beginning to filter through the glass walls of the resort's lobby, illuminating the aftermath of all the recent chaos. A few staff members milled about, some valiantly trying to restore order while others whispered nervously about the rumors still swirling in the press. Lincoln guided Naomi upstairs to a quiet lounge, far from prying eyes and curious ears. He locked the door behind them. She sank into a chair, setting the folder carefully on a small coffee table. "I need to figure out where my twins will be safest," she said, voice soft yet resolute. "After that text message, I can't risk Oliver or his henchmen tracking them down. I've tried to shield them all this time, but it's only getting worse." Lincoln nodded, pacing the length of the room. The floors were polished marble, a testament to the resort's opulence and, ironically, part of the world he'd once guarded so fiercely. "You can't do this alone," he said. "We'll protect them. I have resources, security teams, whatever it takes." Naomi's eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I appreciate it," she whispered. "I already talked to a friend who lives near the coast. She runs a cozy inn, pretty off-grid. The twins can stay there until we figure out how to neutralize Oliver. At least they'll be out of immediate danger." Outside the lounge, an uneasy hush settled over the resort. Employees tapped away at computers, finalizing lists of guests who were set to check in soon, assuming the opening wouldn't be boycotted altogether. News of the scandal was everywhere. Gossip columns labeled Lincoln a careless father who'd abandoned his responsibilities, while talk shows debated Naomi's motives in hiding his children. Investors were calling hourly, some threatening to sever ties if the negative press persisted. Determined to keep a low profile, Naomi retrieved a plain coat and slipped out to the nearest exit. Lincoln followed, a security officer trailing at a respectful distance. They crossed to the parking area where a black sedan waited with tinted windows. Inside, Naomi found her twins, Emma and Eli, strapped into car seats, blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding around them. A trusted friend, Bella, greeted Naomi with a reassuring smile from the driver's seat. Emma, with her soft curls, spotted Naomi through the open door and stretched out tiny arms. Eli, half asleep, rubbed his eyes and reached for his mother's hand. Naomi's heart clenched at the sight of them, both so innocent, so vulnerable. She glanced back at Lincoln, who hovered behind her, transfixed by the children he barely knew yet already felt compelled to protect. He crouched by the car, his gaze lingering on Emma's bright eyes. For a moment, the tension around them eased. "Hey there," he said softly, voice catching on unfamiliar emotion. Emma babbled something incoherent, little fists grabbing the air as if inviting him closer. Cautiously, Lincoln offered his hand, and she wrapped her small fingers around one of his. A gentle smile curved his lips. Naomi felt a rush of warmth at the sight. She brushed a hand over Emma's hair and whispered, "Mommy has to do some important things, but you'll be safe with Bella, okay? It won't be for long, I promise." Emma seemed content, entranced by Lincoln's presence. Eli, still sleepy, simply rested his head against Bella's shoulder. Naomi stood, pulling the car door closed. "Take them far enough away so no one can follow easily," she instructed Bella, handing over a small envelope of emergency funds and instructions. Bella nodded, casting a sympathetic glance at Lincoln before starting the engine. With a soft hum, the sedan glided out of the lot, the twins peering through the rear window until the vehicle disappeared into the morning light. A hollow ache settled in Naomi's chest. She exhaled unsteadily and turned to Lincoln. "They're safe now," she said, more to reassure herself than to inform him. "For the moment." He stepped closer, placing a hand on her arm. "We'll make sure it stays that way. We have that folder, and we'll find more proof of Oliver's schemes. Once we expose him, he loses his leverage." A staff member sprinted over, practically breathless. "Sir, the rumor is spreading that you're hiding the twins. People are outraged, and a group of activists is threatening to protest at the resort entrance. They're demanding answers about your supposed exploitation of workers, too." The poor man looked as if he wished to vanish rather than deliver bad news. Lincoln's jaw tightened. "We'll address it," he replied with forced calm. "But right now, see that guests feel welcome. Keep everything running as smoothly as possible. We still have an opening to salvage." The staff member nodded, darting off. Naomi looked at Lincoln, guilt etched across her features. "I never meant for your business to take such a hit," she said softly. He lifted a shoulder in a shrug that didn't quite hide the strain. "My business can recover. Right now, the real priority is our children's safety, and if possible, clearing our names so we can live without fear." His voice gentled. "You did what you had to do, Naomi." They walked side by side through a short corridor leading into a private conference room. She noticed how quiet the hallways were, staff clearly avoiding them out of respect or discomfort. Behind closed doors, the swirl of gossip soared. Yet, ironically, the outward impression was one of cold professionalism, a resort with a polished veneer, even as fires burned beneath. Once inside the conference room, Olivia and a few others on Lincoln's team were bent over laptops, combing through data they'd salvaged from the battered folder. A hush fell when Lincoln and Naomi entered. Olivia rose, pushing her glasses up her nose. "We found references to a second shell company," she said. "It might lead to more of Oliver's fraudulent activity." Naomi exhaled slowly, looking over the files. "I recognize that name," she said, pointing to one of the lines. "He used it to funnel funds to a handful of shady contractors. If we can track the bank accounts and cross-reference them with his media payouts, we can prove he's paying for slander." Lincoln nodded. "And that means we can discredit his entire smear campaign." An undercurrent of hope coursed through the room. While the team worked, a ripple of anxiety passed through Naomi. She couldn't shake the memory of that threatening text. She wondered if Oliver already had people on the move. She thought of Emma and Eli trusting her to keep them safe. She could almost feel the clock ticking. Lincoln, sensing her unease, reached over to rest a comforting hand on hers. "They're fine," he murmured. "Bella will call if anything comes up." An urgent knock on the door interrupted them. A harried marketing director poked his head in, looking frazzled. "Sir, the official opening ceremony is in jeopardy. We've received multiple cancellations. Some journalists say they won't attend unless you publicly address the allegations, and a few donors are threatening to pull out completely." Lincoln took a measured breath. "Arrange a press statement for this afternoon. We'll release enough information to challenge Oliver's lies, but we have to be certain our evidence is solid." Naomi watched as the marketing director hurried away. Another wave of guilt washed over her. She had vanished months ago to avoid exactly this kind of spectacle, only to have it blow up even worse. But seeing Lincoln's determination, she realized she wasn't alone this time, and that changed everything. A ping sounded from one of the laptops. Olivia's eyes widened. "This might be big," she said, scrolling down a series of scanned documents. "Look here. Payments from Oliver's account to a blog known for sensational stories about corporate wrongdoing. The amounts increase right before every major news leak against you." Naomi stepped closer, scanning the names and dates. A flicker of triumph lit her features. That's the blog that broke the story about unethical labor practices, right? Exactly, Olivia confirmed. If we can link Oliver to these payouts, it proves he's orchestrating the entire smear campaign. Lincoln leaned over her shoulder. Compile it. Put it in a format the average observer can understand without question. Once we release it, Oliver's credibility goes out the window. Olivia nodded, tapping at the keys. We'll need to be fast. He could try to bury these records or threaten the blog's administrators into silence. Lincoln steeled his expression, stepping away from the table. I'll contact legal counsel. Naomi, can you help cross-check more of these transactions? Of course, she agreed. Though her voice trembled with the residue of adrenaline, a current of renewed determination pulsed within her. They were close. If they could follow this lead, they might finally put Oliver on the defensive. Hours slipped by in a flurry of phone calls and digital sleuthing. Outside, a restless crowd began to form at the resort's gates, some holding signs demanding justice, others gawking with cameras. The staff tried to maintain a calm environment for the few guests still arriving, while security guards monitored the gates with careful vigilance. Naomi hovered near a window at one point, looking down at the small throng. Her stomach clenched when she spotted a reporter's sign referencing the twins. Where are Lincoln's children? Why is he hiding them? She stepped away before she could be recognized, a fresh wave of anxiety flooding her system. By evening, the tension had wound tight enough to snap. A hush settled in the corridors as staff and guests alike sensed a confrontation brewing just under the resort's polished surface. Security patrolled methodically, expecting trouble any moment. Naomi and Lincoln were closeted away in the office, verifying the final set of documents Olivia had uncovered. They were so engrossed in their work that when Lincoln's phone rang, it startled them both. He picked it up, pressing it to his ear. No caller ID. A muffled crackle sounded, followed by a distorted voice. Naomi's eyes locked on Lincoln's face as his expression hardened. Then the voice came through clearly. You're running out of time. Give up or lose everything. Lincoln lowered the phone, his pulse thudding in his ears. The distorted voice still echoed in his mind. You're running out of time. Give up or lose everything. His knuckles whitened around the device. Naomi, watching him from across the office, read the grim tension in his eyes and understood that another threat had just been delivered. Outside, night had draped the resort in hushed darkness, broken only by the glow of security lights bouncing off manicured hedges. She approached him cautiously. We can't just sit here waiting for Oliver to make his next move, she said, her voice quavering beneath a layer of resolve. We're so close to proving his guilt. Lincoln slid the phone into his pocket. You're right, he replied, tone quiet but resolute. We push forward. We have to do something bigger. They had spent the last hour combing through suspicious invoices and bank statements, building a case that Oliver was funding smear campaigns and forging evidence. But Oliver's threats were intensifying, and the small crowd protesting at the resort gates was getting bolder, fueled by rumors he had carefully planted. Lincoln hated feeling cornered in his own domain. A soft knock on the office door broke the stillness. One of the security staff stepped in, eyeing them both with urgency. We've located someone who might help, he said. An ex-accountant of Oliver's. He's nervous, but he claims he has proof that could seal the deal. Some kind of digital records backing up your paper trail. Lincoln and Naomi exchanged quick glances. This was exactly what they needed. A whistleblower with a treasure trove of data. But it was risky. If Oliver discovered this man's betrayal, the consequences would be swift and brutal. Where can we meet him? Naomi asked, instincts honed from her consulting days kicking in. The guard checked a note on his phone. He suggests a cafe off the main highway near the edge of town. It's quiet after dark. He said to come alone, but he trailed off, obviously aware that going without protection would be reckless. Lincoln inhaled sharply. We'll bring minimal backup. I won't walk into this unarmed. He looked at Naomi. You in? She nodded, nerves fluttering in her stomach. If that's what it takes to end this nightmare, yes. Under the cover of night, they slipped out of the resort through a side entrance to avoid the prying eyes of reporters and protesters. A single security vehicle tailed them at a discreet distance, headlights off until they reached the main road. The tension in the car felt almost tangible. Naomi ran her fingers over the battered folder in her lap, recalling the near-disastrous encounter at the abandoned warehouse. She prayed this meeting wouldn't turn out the same, or worse. They arrived at the cafe around closing time. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting an erratic pink glow on the parking lot. Inside, only a few customers remained, most of them finishing coffee or scrolling through phones. The whistleblower waited at a corner table, hunched over an empty mug. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes rimmed with red, shoulders tense beneath a cheap blazer. Lincoln and Naomi approached cautiously. The man glanced up, anxiety evident. "Name's Darius," he offered with a shaky breath. I used to work for Oliver as his financial controller, but I left after he started forcing me to doctor invoices." Naomi studied him. He looked sincere, driven more by fear than greed. "And you have proof?" she pressed, keeping her voice low. Darius nodded. From inside a worn satchel, he pulled out a small USB drive. "Encrypted documents, files with ledger revisions. There's enough to bury him. Emails that show how he planned to sabotage you." His gaze skittered around the cafe as though expecting Oliver's men to burst in at any moment. Lincoln exhaled a flood of relief, tinged with caution. "We can protect you, but we need what's on that drive." Darius's eyes brimmed with desperation. "After I quit, Oliver warned me never to talk, but I saw the news. About you, about the resort, the kids. He's going too far. I can't stay silent anymore." He glanced around once more, shoulders trembling. "But if he finds out I helped you, I'm done for." Lincoln placed a reassuring hand on the table. "We'll do everything we can," he promised. "Just help us end this." Before Darius could reply, the cafe door flew open with a jingle of bells and a blast of cold night air. Two figures walked in, scanning the room. Naomi's heart dropped. She recognized the distinct shape of Oliver's head of security, a thick-set man with a scowl carved into his features. He was joined by a leaner partner, eyes narrow and predatory. "They're here," Naomi whispered, pulse racing. Instinctively, she pressed closer to Lincoln, shielding Darius. The men spotted them immediately, heading in their direction with an air of grim purpose. Darius swallowed hard, fumbling the USB into Naomi's hand under the table. "Go," he rasped. "I'll hold them off. Just make sure this gets out." Lincoln set his jaw. "We can't just leave you." One of the men from Oliver's security detail reached inside his coat, likely for a weapon. The cafe staff behind the counter froze, unsure whether to intervene or call the police. Time stretched thin. Lincoln grabbed Naomi's hand, ushering her behind him. "We won't let them hurt you," he whispered to Darius. But the man gave them a terrified look that told them he didn't believe it was possible. The moment snapped. The thick-set security chief lunged, trying to shove Lincoln aside to get at Darius. Lincoln blocked the blow with his forearm. Chairs screeched against tile as diners scrambled away, some pulling out phones to record or call for help. The other intruder circled, eyes fixed on Naomi. Her chest tightened. She clutched the USB in her hand, determined not to lose the precious evidence. A burst of action followed. Lincoln feinted left, hooking a punch at the thick-set man's jaw. The blow partially landed, sending him reeling back a step. Naomi ducked as the second man tried to grab the folder from her arm. She twisted away, adrenaline granting her a surge of strength. Darius, braver than he seemed, attempted to swing a chair at one of the men, but was knocked to the ground. "Oliver wants the drive," the lean partner snarled, voice low and fierce. "Hand it over, or this ends badly." Naomi felt fear constrict her throat, but she recalled the children's faces. Emma, and Eli. She refused to let Oliver's darkness swallow them. "Never!" she spat, hugging the drive close. Lincoln seized the momentary distraction, delivering a forceful shove that sent the lean man stumbling. He grabbed Naomi's arm. "We've got to go now." On the floor, Darius gasped for air, trying to stand. He beckoned them to leave, tears brimming in his eyes. His whispered, "Go!" drowned by the cafe's chaos. They slipped out a side entrance, hearts hammering. The cold air stung Naomi's lungs. She and Lincoln sprinted across the parking lot, weaving between cars. Tires screeched as a vehicle belonging to Oliver's men peeled in front of them, blocking the exit. Lights flared, pinning them momentarily in place. But their own security detail appeared behind, headlights cutting across the gloom. The two cars nearly collided, each refusing to yield. Lincoln yanked open the door of their waiting SUV. Naomi slid in, panting, the USB still clutched in her trembling hand. Their driver gunned the engine, reversing at an angle and narrowly avoiding a trash bin. One of Oliver's men emerged from his car, fists clenched, but he was too late to stop them. With a squeal of tires, the SUV sped onto the main road. Inside, tension pinned them to their seats. Naomi tried to steady her breathing, the frantic images of the cafe swirling in her head. Lincoln, adrenaline surging, braced a hand against the doorframe. The driver took a sharp turn, merging into traffic that was mercifully light at this late hour. Naomi wiped sweat from her brow. "Darius, did he get out?" she asked, voice shaking. She felt sick at the thought of leaving him behind. But she'd had no choice. Lincoln's grim expression spoke volumes. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "We'll do what we can, get him safe. But we have to secure that drive." Darius risked everything. Naomi nodded, protective hands cupping the USB. "Then let's make it count." Her voice wavered between anger and heartbreak. This was exactly how Oliver operated: intimidation, violence, never giving his victims a chance to fight back fairly. They spent the ride in anxious silence, scanning the rearview mirror in case Oliver's men decided to follow. Once certain they weren't being pursued, they directed the driver to a small private tech firm Lincoln had on retainer. Even at this hour, a technician agreed to meet them, bleary-eyed but loyal. Inside a discreet office, the neon hum of overhead lights felt disorienting after the chaos. Naomi watched, pulse still thrumming, as the tech carefully inserted the USB drive into a secure laptop. Rows of encrypted files appeared on screen. At a quick glance, there were references to bank transfers, internal memos, instructions for discrediting Hollister resorts. Some documents were flagged with Oliver's personal notations, sufficient to connect him directly to sabotage. A tremor coursed through Lincoln. This was the final piece they'd been hunting, hard, digital proof that Oliver Beck orchestrated the entire smear. The violence, the threats, the campaign to paint Lincoln as a deadbeat father and shady businessman. Here it all was, in black and white, just as Darius had promised. Naomi's phone chimed. She flinched, half expecting another text from an unknown number. Instead, it was a message from Olivia back at the resort. "The press conference is on for tomorrow. Oliver is planning to unveil some shocking proof against you." The words made Naomi's hands sweat. She looked at Lincoln. He gazed at the screen, shoulders taut. They knew exactly what Oliver's next move would be, an all-out assault on Lincoln's character and the legitimacy of his business. But now they had something even bigger to launch in response. Naomi drew a breath. "We can turn this around, Lincoln. With these files, the world will finally see Oliver for who he is." Lincoln exhaled, eyes set with fierce determination. "Yeah," he murmured, "we have enough to bury him. But will it be in time for the press conference?" The sun was dipping low on the horizon when Lincoln and Naomi arrived at the modern, glass-walled event center on the far side of town. Dozens of reporters and camera crews clustered at the entrance, forming a gauntlet of tripods and questions for anyone daring to walk through the doors. News vans lined the street, each bearing a station's logo plastered in bold letters. Microphones were poised, lenses sharpened, Everyone was waiting for Oliver Beck's press conference. Lincoln felt his heart hammer in his chest as he stepped out of the car. He adjusted his jacket, then reached to help Naomi, who clutched a slim briefcase holding the precious evidence they had fought so hard to compile. Today was the day Oliver intended to unleash his final blow, accusing Lincoln of harboring unethical practices and fathering secret twins he'd supposedly abandoned. But the tides had turned. Naomi and Lincoln had the USB drive. And, in a stroke of luck, the whistleblower, Darius, was alive and willing to testify, albeit nervous and nursing a bruised rib from the cafe scuffle. A short distance away, the main doors of the event center slid open and shut as staff hustled to prepare the stage. Sleek glass panels offered a glimpse of a podium draped with a deep red cloth. Rows of chairs filled up quickly with journalists, business figures, and the occasional curious onlooker. The hum of anticipation rolled through the crowd like electricity. Naomi took a shaky breath, stepping closer to Lincoln. "He's going to make the first move," she whispered. "We have to let him lay out his accusations, and then we'll strike back with the truth." Lincoln squeezed her hand, trying to steady his pulse. "We stand tall. We reveal everything, his sabotage, his blackmail. That's the only way we stop him once and for all." They navigated the press throng at the doors, ignoring a barrage of shouted questions. "Mr. Hollister, are you prepared to respond to Oliver Beck's claims? Is it true you have more children nobody knows about? Why hide the twins?" Lincoln offered a steely silence, gently guiding Naomi inside. Behind them, security kept the more aggressive reporters from following. Within the event hall, the ambiance was carefully arranged. Bright overhead lights, seats neatly aligned, a spotlight on a raised platform. As if on cue, Oliver strode onto the stage. He wore an impeccable suit and exuded that trademark confidence, an air of smug expectation that tonight would be his grand triumph. Spotting Lincoln near the back, he offered a tight, mocking smile. Then he leaned into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," Oliver began, voice carrying smoothly over the speaker system. "I've called this press conference to shed light on questionable practices and concealed truths that pertain to Hollister Resorts and their CEO, Lincoln Hollister." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Camera lenses zoomed in on Oliver's face, capturing every nuance. Lincoln held his ground near a side aisle with Naomi and Darius beside him. A few seats away, Olivia fiddled with her phone, poised to send the incriminating files to every major media outlet at Lincoln's signal. Oliver continued, shifting smoothly into showmanship. "For too long, Mr. Hollister has presented himself as a visionary entrepreneur, but behind that facade, there's a disturbing record of labor exploitation, falsified reports, and a scandal involving children he kept hidden." He flicked his gaze around, letting the dramatic pause land on the crowd like a hammer. "I'm here to expose the truth." A low murmur spread among the gathered reporters. Some glanced at Lincoln, who stood calmly, refusing to take the bait. Oliver's smug grin widened. "We have evidence, signed affidavits, photographic proof, that Hollister Resorts underpaid construction crews, manipulated contracts, and compromised worker safety to cut corners and boost profits." Oliver gestured to an assistant who projected a series of documents onto a large screen. Half looked genuine, the rest obviously doctored or taken out of context. Scattered gasps arose from the audience. Lincoln maintained a measured silence, though inside he felt a simmering anger. He wanted to stand and refute every word, but he stuck to the plan. Let Oliver think he had the upper hand until the final moment. "And as for these so-called hidden children," Oliver said, lowering his voice dramatically, "I think you'll agree that a man who refuses to publicly acknowledge his own offspring is unfit to run a company. We have images of the twins." A slideshow flickered on screen, showing candid shots of Emma and Eli playing on a beach, with insinuations in bold text reading, "Abandoned?" or "Ignored?" In the seats, journalists turned to Lincoln, waiting for a reaction. He offered them only a stony expression. Naomi felt tears prickle at the sight of her children's faces magnified for scandalous purposes. She clenched her fists, trembling with anger. Oliver smirked, sensing victory, and advanced to his concluding remarks. "This is the real Lincoln Hollister," he declared, "a profiteer with no regard for family, for decency, or for ethics in business. Let these revelations speak for themselves." He paused, enjoying the hush that fell over the hall. Reporters jotted frantic notes, cameras panned to Lincoln, who was still standing in the aisle, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on Oliver. Just then, Lincoln nodded toward Olivia. She tapped her phone's screen, confirming that all the digital evidence was set to go. Then Lincoln stepped forward, ignoring the flash of cameras that greeted his movement. "May I respond?" he asked, voice carrying in the silent space. Oliver's expression flickered with discomfort, but he plastered on a condescending grin. "Of course," he offered. "We believe in hearing all sides." Lincoln took the stage, guiding Naomi and Darius with him. The hush in the room felt heavy with possibilities. Naomi's heart pounded as she prepared to address the onlookers who'd just seen pictures of her children cast in a cruel light. "Thank you for giving me a moment," Lincoln said calmly. "You've heard Oliver's side. Now, let's uncover the rest." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Many of these documents he showed are doctored. The allegations of underpaid workers are false. And my so-called abandonment of my children? I learned I was a father only recently. The mother of those twins, Naomi Stone, stands beside me now." A murmur ran through the audience. Oliver's smile wavered, but he tried to mask it with a bored arch of his brow. Lincoln gestured to Naomi, who swallowed her nerves and stepped up to the microphone. "I was Oliver Beck's target," she said, voice shaking at first before gathering strength. "He threatened me, blackmailed me, forced me into hiding. I disappeared not because Lincoln abandoned the children, but because Oliver made me believe my kids would be in danger if I told the truth." A pained hush settled. Naomi lifted her gaze toward the cameras, tears shining in her eyes. "That's the man you're all trusting as your source." Oliver shifted on his feet, color creeping up his neck. "She's lying," he spat, but the crowd didn't share his quick dismissal. They seemed transfixed by Naomi's trembling earnestness. Lincoln took over. "For those of you who doubt, we have proof of Oliver's sabotage and bribery." He nodded to Olivia again, who connected the laptop to the large screen. In seconds, the curated files from the USB appeared. Bank statements showing unexplained payments to a gossip blog, emails referencing defamatory articles, and multiple transactions from Oliver's shell companies funneling money to hamper Hollister resorts. Reporters craned their necks, eyes going wide. A wave of murmurs rose, louder than before. Camera flashes erupted, capturing each damning piece of evidence. The tension was electric. Oliver's face turned ashen as the magnitude of the proof sank in. "That's not all," Lincoln continued. "We have a witness, someone who worked under Oliver and can confirm everything." He beckoned to Darius, who stepped forward cautiously. Bruises still marred his cheeks. The ex-accountant managed a shaky nod, swallowing hard as microphones swung his way. "The documents you see are real," Darius confirmed. "I oversaw them personally. Oliver Beck forced me to manipulate spreadsheets, channel funds to pay false witnesses, even set up intimidation tactics. I have more data to share if needed." An uproar of questions flooded the hall. Oliver bristled. "This is a smear campaign against me," he roared, jabbing a finger at Darius. "He's disgruntled, fired for incompetence." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. The previously impressed murmurs had turned to critical stares aimed at Oliver. A wave of cell phones lifted overhead, snapping pictures, recording video, sending the dramatic reversal out into the digital world in real time. The tide had shifted in an instant. The dominating factor was no longer Oliver's flamboyant accusations, but Lincoln and Naomi's damning evidence. Furious, Oliver tried a final gambit. No matter what you claim, the fact remains. Lincoln Hollister fathered twins and kept them out of the public eye for nearly 2 years. His voice trembled with desperation. He's an irresponsible father, more concerned with profit than— Naomi cut him off, stepping forward with unexpected fierceness. I left because of you, she hissed. You threatened my children. Lincoln never even knew about them until I returned. And now, you dare accuse him of negligence? A palpable hush followed her words. Several reporters, previously scribbling furiously, paused to study Oliver's rigid posture. The tension spiraled as security personnel edged closer, sensing the storm about to break. Then, a flurry of motion as uniformed police officers entered from the back. They'd been waiting for confirmation that the new evidence was genuine. With a curt nod from one detective, they stepped forward. Oliver spun, confusion and rage etching across his features. "What are you— This is a setup!" he shouted. "I'm the victim here!" But the detective calmly informed him they had grounds to detain him for questioning on charges of blackmail and fraud. Oliver jerked away, shouting curses. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Microphones rattled as reporters tried to capture every syllable of his furious tirade. Security guards joined the officers in restraining him. Caught in the swirl of camera shutters and raised voices, Oliver Beck strained against their grip, eyes full of burning hatred. Veins stood out on his neck, sweat shining on his temples. As bystanders watched, stunned, Oliver spat one final threat, his voice echoing through the chaos. "This isn't over, Hollister. Our family's feud runs deeper than you think." Morning sunlight spilled across the resort's gleaming lobby, illuminating the tension and relief that lingered from the night before. Security staff stood by the doors, but the lingering crowd of reporters had thinned, replaced by calmer onlookers. News outlets were abuzz with the dramatic fall of Oliver Beck, whose accusations had swiftly turned into his own undoing. For once it seemed the tide was truly turning in Lincoln Hollister's favor. Inside a private meeting room, Naomi paced near the window, occasionally glancing out at the ocean. She was waiting for word about Oliver's status, but also grappling with how to move forward now that the truth was out in public. She could still hear his last shout as security led him away. "This isn't over, Hollister. Our family's feud runs deeper than you think." Even recalling it sent a tremor of unease through her, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the tangible victory they'd just secured. Her phone buzzed. She fished it from her pocket. A text from Bella. "The twins are fine, safe and sound." A wave of relief washed through her, and she closed her eyes, letting the tension slip away. She had lived in fear for so long, always looking over her shoulder, certain Oliver would ruin not only her life but her children's. Now, with him in custody, the horizon felt unexpectedly open. The door opened behind her, and Lincoln entered. He looked more composed than he had in days, though his tie hung loose around his collar, and faint circles smudged the skin beneath his eyes. He carried a sheaf of documents, setting them on the table. "The board is convening in half an hour," he told her, exhaling a shallow breath. "They want an update. Investors, staff, the press, everyone's demanding clarity about what happens next." Naomi nodded. "And what are you going to tell them?" "That I knew nothing about your pregnancy until recently. That Oliver manipulated events, paid off bloggers and fake witnesses, and that the labor allegations are false." He spread his hands in a gesture that was half frustration, half resolve. "The good news is we have enough documentation to clear all that up. The bad news is, some people will choose to believe gossip anyway." She moved to stand beside him, her gaze wandering to the top pages on the table. They contained details verifying that the workers on the resort were paid above union rates, that the building was up to code, that the so-called unethical practices were fabrications. It was all there, in black and white, but she knew too well that once rumors spread, they were hard to kill completely. "We'll do our best to address everything," she said quietly. "We just need to speak plainly, show the evidence, and let time handle the rest." He studied her a moment, expression softening. "I want you by my side when I talk to them. The board, the press, everyone. People deserve to hear your side too." Her heart squeezed at the thought. If that's what it takes to stop the lies, then yes. She lifted her chin, letting determination settle over her features. "I'm ready." Minutes later, they walked into a large conference room where the board members were already seated, some of them looking uneasy, others clearly impatient. But as Lincoln and Naomi entered together, a hush fell. Whispers that had once carried undertones of suspicion or curiosity died out at the sight of them united, a tangible front against the swirling controversies. Olivia stood near the far end of the table, laptop open, prepared to display relevant files. The bright midday sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating Lincoln as he calmly began his presentation. He explained the sabotage, showing how each of Oliver's claims unraveled under scrutiny. Then Naomi stepped forward, voice trembling slightly at first, but strengthening as she recounted the threats that forced her into hiding with the twins. She finished by affirming that she had returned to reveal the truth, not to shame or extort. The board members listened in silence, absorbing every piece of evidence Olivia presented on the screen. By the end, a slow current of empathy replaced their earlier wariness. One older gentleman who had been particularly skeptical nodded, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "Well," he said, "it's clear you two have been under vicious attack. We appreciate your transparency now." Relief sagged Naomi's shoulders. Lincoln showed them printouts of the new investor commitments that had come in overnight. Some philanthropic partners decided to stand by him after seeing how quickly the false allegations were exposed. The mood in the room turned cautiously optimistic. Even the most critical voices recognized that the tide had shifted back in Hollister Resort's favor. A staff member opened the door, ushering a small group of reporters inside for a brief but formal statement. Cameras clicked, microphones hovered. Lincoln started off by thanking everyone who held faith in them and apologizing if confusion had caused undue concern. He looked poised, still a commanding presence but more vulnerable than before. A hush settled as he spoke about fatherhood, about discovering the twins, and how it changed his perception of what truly mattered. "And now," he said, clearing his throat, "I'd like to introduce Naomi Stone, the mother of my children, and a vital part of our effort to expose the truth. She can clarify why she disappeared and how Oliver Beck manipulated the entire situation." Naomi stepped up, nerves fluttering. The cameras angled toward her, capturing her every breath. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a glass panel, looking more determined than she felt. Taking a quiet breath, she told the story again. How Oliver had blackmailed her, how she feared for the twins, how she believed Lincoln might cast her aside if he found out. The hush in the room deepened, each word echoing in the silent, rapt attention of the reporters. When she finished, the silence broke in a flurry of questions. "Will you remain at Hollister Resorts? Where are the children now? Did you ever fear for their safety?" Naomi answered as calmly as she could, explaining that Emma and Eli were in a secure location while they settled the legal steps to ensure Oliver couldn't harm them. She made it clear that Lincoln had never known about the pregnancy until her return. And the reporters took notes, their pens scribbling frantically. Finally, the group parted, letting them step away from the crowd. A sense of relief and fatigue washed over Naomi. She felt Lincoln's warm hand on her shoulder, steadying her. The board members dispersed, some nodding with approval and reassurance. Outside the big windows, the sun glimmered across the ocean, sending motes of light dancing on the waves. Somehow it seemed to signal a new beginning. By late afternoon, the resort staff had organized a second, smaller ceremony to solidify the official opening. They had lost the grand spectacle thanks to Oliver's meddling, but a few guests still gathered near the polished walkway overlooking the shore, waiting to see if Hollister Resorts could rise above the scandal. Lincoln, with Naomi at his side, stood on the sunlit platform to speak. He offered a brief, heartfelt address, thanking everyone who'd supported them through the crisis. He spoke openly about discovering he had children, about the importance of family, and how he intended to make the resort a place where families could create memories without fear. Applause broke out in pockets of the audience, growing stronger as each sentence underscored honesty and hope. Naomi glanced around, heart swelling at the crowd's reaction. They believed him. Partway through, a black sedan pulled up. Bella stepped out, carefully helping Emma and Eli onto the walkway. The twins squinted at the bright afternoon sun, their tiny hands shielding their eyes. A murmur of surprise rippled through the onlookers. Lincoln's voice caught for a moment as he noticed them, genuine emotion surfacing in his gaze. Emma recognized him from across the short distance and let out a delighted squeal. She toddled forward, arms lifted. Eli followed, more timid, clinging to Bella's hand. Lincoln bent down, scooping Emma up. The microphone in his other hand made a small feedback squeak, but no one seemed to mind. The crowd looked on, cameras capturing the tender moment. Naomi approached, picking up Eli, who gazed shyly at the array of curious faces. After a beat, Lincoln returned to the microphone, Emma perched securely on his hip. His voice was quieter now, yet firm and resonant. Discovering I have 2 children, that I'm responsible for them, has changed me more than any business deal ever could, he said, eyes scanning the audience. It's taught me that success isn't about profit margins or PR campaigns. It's about the lives we touch and the legacy we leave for those who come after us. Eli clung to Naomi, his gaze jumping from the crowd to the ocean. Naomi leaned close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, feeling a surge of gratitude. She realized with sweet clarity that they were finally free from Oliver's shadows. There would be more battles ahead. She could still hear Oliver's parting threat echoing in her mind, but for now, the warmth of this moment eclipsed her fears. A gentle breeze drifted in from the sea, rustling palm fronds and carrying the soft hush of waves behind them. Lincoln took a deep breath, looking not at the press or the board members, but at Naomi and the children in his arms. Then, turning back to the small gathering, he spoke in a voice that carried the resonance of a heartfelt promise. "If true wealth lies in the people you share your life with," he said, "then I'm the richest man in the world." The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Sunlight gleamed off camera lenses, capturing the family's embrace. Lincoln, Naomi, Emma, and Eli framed by the rolling surf and glowing horizon. Olivia clapped with tears shining in her eyes. Staff members grinned at one another, and a sense of genuine, hopeful completion spread through the assembled onlookers. Naomi felt Emma's tiny fingers tug at her hair, and Eli's weight shift in her arms. She glanced at Lincoln, whose face shone with a freedom she'd never seen before. Together, they looked out over the crowd, not as a CEO and a consultant with secrets, but as a family stepping toward the future. The applause echoed as the family stood united at last, beginning a brand new chapter in their lives. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.